Okay, so this is Mr. Gilbert again, doing another tutorial of how to use Fusion 360. So far, you've been taught a range of skills from extruding, drawing, measuring, press pull, dimensioning, all sorts of different skills. Today, I'm going to teach you something completely different, and we're going to start talking about how to sculpt. Okay, so you'll be used to seeing here the modeling tool, the modeling drop-down menu, where you've been doing most of your work. Today we're going to be sculpting in the sculpting menu. Why do you sculpt? So you sculpt when you want to design something that's made in sort of a rounded form. Okay, so something that's made sort of a lot more curves in it and things like that. And there's lots of different sculpting things you can do. We're going to start with a basic sculpting of a spoon today. Okay, so a spoon is very circular, very round in form, and here's the sort of finished spoon that you're going to make by the end of today's tutorial. Okay, so to get started, what we need to do is we need to go, as we've done lots of times before, we're going to click on File, and then we're going to create a new design. And that gives us our page to start creating our object. Now, when you're sculpting, you need to think about what to use as a starting point. Okay, so if you imagine you're making a sculpture and you're making it out of clay, you'd start with a block of clay, and then you'd start manipulating that, pushing and pulling it around to give yourself the shape you require. So, and this is no different to that. So if we look at our spoon, okay, we have our handle, which we'll talk about later. But we've got the scooping part of our spoon, and we need to think about, right, well, what's the basic shape that's going to be? Now, the closest shape I can think of to that is a sphere. Okay, so we're going to go back into here. We're going to go on to create form, which is on the top one here. And then we're going to choose what we want as our starting point. So we're going to click on create, and I'm going to create a sphere. So I'm going to click on sphere. Then what it needs to know, as we've done lots of times, is which plane we want to draw on. So I'm going to draw on my horizontal plane. Okay, so clicking here, I know I'm drawing it on my horizontal plane, and I'm going to basically start my sphere right in the middle. Okay, so this brings down this box here, and what I can do is I can alter the size of my sphere, either by dragging it out or by changing the numerical value of the diameter. Okay, so but I'm not worried about that. I'm going to keep it at 40. I'm not worried about what size my spoon is for now. And what I can then do is I can alter the amount of faces it has. Okay, so I can alter the faces in longitude, or I can alter my faces in latitude. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to change it so they are both 8 and 8, keeping it symmetrical. And what that does is gives me more or less faces. And obviously, the more faces you have, the more sort of pulling around, the more detail you can add into it later on. So I'm going to click OK. I've got my 8 faces. Okay, so I've got my sphere. What I now need to do is I need to make it look a little bit more like a spoon. Now, a spoon isn't a sphere, so I need to remove the top half to give me my scoop part down the bottom. So I'm going to select the part I want to remove, okay, by just drawing a box around it, left clicking and selecting it by drawing a box around, and then on my keyboard I'm going to push the delete key. Okay, so what that's done is that's now deleted about 2/3 of my sphere. So I'm just left with a sort of bowl shape, or hopefully something that's starting to look a little bit like the spoon, the scooping part of our spoon. Okay, now at the moment it's not spoon shape. A spoon is more of a oval. So what I can do is I can start manipulating and pulling, pushing and pulling, sorry, my lines around to make it more spoon shape. So I'm going to select the front 2 sections here, and then I'm just going to right click. Okay, so I'm selecting those 2 lines, holding shift down to select more than one. I'm going to right click on my mouse, and I'm going to edit that form. Okay, now what that does is that brings up a menu, and it allows me to do lots of different things. I can pull it out like so, or I can scale it like so, or I can scale it in all sorts of directions. I can pull it to the side, I can drag it all out like that, and basically what you need to do is just play around. Okay, so drag it about, pull it in different directions until you start making it look a little bit more like a spoon. Okay, so there you go, that's a little bit more spoon shape, a bit more oval in shape, looks a bit more spoon like. And when you're happy with that, you just click enter, and it gives you your shape like that. So that's a little bit more, starting to look like a little bit more like a spoon. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to do the same thing on the back, holding shift down to select more than one of the lines there, more than one of these faces. And I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to click edit form. And then I'm going to drag that a little bit out like this. Okay, I'm going to grab this one and bring it a little bit flatter like that. Then what I want to do is I want to start making my handle section. So I want the handle to come out from out the back here. So I'm going to keep those selected, and I'm going to press Alt on my keyboard. And by pushing Alt, that will allow me to start dragging out my handle. Okay, so there's my handle starting to drag out. I'm going to click Enter. Now, I've made it a little bit wide there, so I'm just going to select these 2 points here by clicking on them with our left mouse button. And I'm going to right click and click Edit Form. And I'm just going to drag, whoops, I've selected the wrong thing there. So I'm going to try that again. Hold Shift down. I'm going to click, it's already on Edit Form, so I don't need to do that. I'm just going to bring those a little bit narrower, make it look a little bit more spoon-like. Okay, but you can have a play around with the shape of your spoon until you get it basically how you want it. Okay, so now back onto my handle. I want to select these bits. I'm still in the edit form, so I don't need to keep doing that, but I can then drag out and move my spoon around. If I press Alt, then it will let me extend out the form like so. Okay, now I'm getting a little bit more handle. I just need to drag it out a little bit more. Okay, holding Alt down, dragging out my spoon. So there's my handle of my spoon that's been dragged out there. Okay, so once you've got the basic shape you want, we can do lots of different things. So I want to make it a little bit more rounded in this direction. I don't want it to be totally flat, or it's not going to be a very comfortable spoon to hold. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these parts here. I'm going to select this part, this part, and this part. I'm just going to raise that up a little bit to make it a little bit more curved. Okay, so a little bit of a curve on there. Okay, and you can play around with the form until you're happy. For example, I'm not particularly happy with how even this is, so you could select those 2 parts, right click, edit form, and you can mess around with it as much as you want. So you can make that a little bit more smooth like that. I could select that point and that point. I could then edit that form, and I could bring those in, and all sorts of different things. Just play around with your buttons until you're happy with and you've got it the way you want it. So there you go, that's starting to look a little bit nicer in terms of the shape. So you can play around with that basically by selecting any part of the spoon, right clicking edit form. You can do that. Now in a moment you can see it almost looks like a spoon, but it's basically it's very thin. It's like a piece of paper, but in the shape of the spoon, if you like. So what we need to do is we need to give this a thickness. So to do that, we need to click on the modify button, and we need to go down until we find thicken. Okay, and what that does is that makes it into a sort of solid object, if you like. It gives it a thickness. So I click on thicken, and then what I can do is select what I want to thicken, and I can decide on my thickness. I can make an absolutely huge spoon and it starts to go wrong after a certain period, or you can make it just a small thickness. So I drag down, that starts at 10 mil. If I don't want it as 10 mil, I can click 2 mil. Okay, so that gives my spoon a thickness. What I then need to do, you might be set on sharp. Okay, again, if it's sharp edges, it means it's going to have sort of 90-degree lines on there. What we want is nice rounded edges for a spoon. We don't want it to be sharp, else it might cut your lips as it goes into your mouth. So we're going to click on soft edges, and then we're going to click on OK. And what that does is that gives it then a thickness. Okay, so it might not look too thick. You can make it a little bit thicker than that potentially, but that's how you give it a thickness. Okay, what I then want to do is make my handle a little bit thicker than everything else. So I'm going to select this face, and holding shift down I can select a few more of my faces like so. Okay, and now if I right click, I missed one there. If I right click, edit form, I can then drag that up, and you can see it starts making it a little bit thicker. Okay, there's probably a little bit too much, so let's give it a bit of a 10mm thickness like that to make it a little bit thicker like that. Okay, now that's the basics of how to start sculpting. It's pretty simple, to be honest. You just have to select the faces or the edges that you want, and then you can, by right-clicking and editing the form, you can change. You can change it. You can pull it around. You can manipulate it in any way you want. Okay, so there's a basic spoon. I think, if I'm being totally honest, my first attempt here, where I spent a little bit more time on it when I wasn't actually recording it, was probably better than the recording that I did for you guys. But have a little play around, see if you can make some cutlery or anything else you want in terms of the sculpting. It's a very handy tool, as I said, for making curved objects rather than just adding a fillet. Okay, this looks a lot more natural and a lot more sort of rounded and gives you a lot more freedom to play around with. Okay, so this has been a tutorial on how to the basics of how to sculpt an object in Fusion 360.